The objective of this video is to present the way of thinking and how to implement a trivial application in Python using unit tests. The objective of this application is pretty simple. I have already found an API which provides us with football data. The site is called footballdata.org, as you can see here, which is a very nice free site that exposes a REST API containing football data. The specific route that we're going to be using for this exercise is called soccer seasons, as you can see here in the highlighted section, and it provides us with a JSON object containing information about the various leagues of European soccer. Now, the objective of the Python project that we're gonna write is to actually retrieve this data from the internet and bring it down to the server in a Python format. The very first thing we'll have to decide is about the connectivity library that we're going to use, and for this I'm going to be using requests. If you don't have it already installed, please go ahead and install requests from the corresponding PIP. So the very first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a component, a Python module, which is going to retrieve the data from the internet. As you can see, I'm using PyCharm, which is an IDE that simplifies a lot of the functionality that is necessary for Python. So I'm creating a Python file. I'm going to call it soccer, and the very first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to import the requests library, which is the library that is going to serve as an abstraction for requesting the data from the internet. I have to specify the URL, which is, I'm going to call it URL soccer seasons, and obviously I'm going to use this URL. Great. Now I'm going to need a function to be exposed from this module. Let's call it get soccer seasons. Which takes no parameters, and I'm expecting this get soccer seasons to return me back a nice Python object that its structure is gonna pretty much mimic what we have here in this JSON object. At this point, you have to realize that this JSON object, indeed, it is a list. It is a list of smaller objects. So we keep this in mind, and we're going to see how we're going to implement this. Okay. Now, for starters, let's see how the mechanism of request is going to work. So let's say I'm going to call it result, and I'm going to ask from requests to fetch the data from here. At this point, I need to start, thinking about testing. At some point you can do something like this if you want to start testing. Although this is not the preferable way. For example, you can say you can execute the get soccer seasons function here. And let's print it just to see what is going to happen. As you can see, the output, it gives us a response 200, which is good. It means that the function ran properly, and we can even print the JSON that came back if we do this. Now you can see it's actually printing a Python dictionary, which is a Python list, not a Python dictionary, a Python list consisting of dictionaries, which is what came back from the request. But that's not a very elegant, neither a good way to test with it, for us to use as a testing to write application. For this, I'm going to create a testing file. I'm going to call it soccer, the same name of the module, and I'm going to append the name with underscore test. So now, in the testing library, I'm going to start by importing the unit test, and I'm going to create a class which by default all my tests, they're going to start, my test class, they're going to start with the prefix test, capital T, and they're going to be followed by the name of the function or the class that I want to test. So in this case, I want to test get soccer seasons, so it's going to be like this, and I'm going to derive this class from unit test dot test case. Now, following this pattern, I'm going to have one testing class for every function or class later that I might have. So let's call this within the testing class. I'm gonna write a testing function, a testing method now, that I'm gonna call it test retrieval. Or test request. Now, obviously, I need to import the module I am testing with it, which is soccer. In here, I'm gonna start playing with the function get soccer seasons and trying to understand what kind of testing I need. So since get sucker seasons returns sucker seasons, it makes sense to call the return value as sucker seasons, and I'm gonna call it like this. And for now, let's see what is coming back from it. Okay. I'm running the unit test, and now as you can see, none came back. Obviously, this happens because I don't return anything from here. So let's start by becoming more um, detailed about our unit tests. Very first thing we have to consider is whether our request was successful or not. We might have some errors in the URL, or the internet might be down, or whatever. So this information, we can find it in the result status code. So for now, I'm returning back the status code. If I run here the same unit test again, you see that now I'm getting a 200, which means that, the request was successful. So for starters, let's say that if I had a successful request, I'm going to return the results JSON, as we showed before. Otherwise, of course, for now it's going to return none. So I'm expecting now, if I run my test, to see this Python list, a list that consists of objects. This pretty much shows us that, we were successful. Our call was successful. Now what happens if there was an error? I'm going to handle it pretty simple right now. And I'm going to create an exception. I'm going to call it sucker request, sucker seasons request failed. And of course I'm going to derive from exception. And in this case, in the case that something happened and the status code is now 200, I will simply raise an exception of this type. Note that I'm not specifying an object of this type. Instead, I'm raising the class itself. This is a trick we usually do because since we are so descriptive in the description of our exception, this usually is enough, at least for most of the cases. So now I'm running my test. Nothing is going to change, of course, here. We're going to see how we're going to test this in a few seconds. Now, we can see that we're getting something back from our request, but somehow we need to be able to test it, to these things that came back from soccer seasons faction, get soccer seasons, we have to be sure that this is what we really wanted it to be. Note that the data that is coming back um, from the site might change anytime. This means that we are not sure what to expect each time that we are making the request. So the fact that this data can change so easily make this unit test a perfect candidate for a mocking test. So we start now to think how to mock our tests to make them more realistic. I'm gonna add a helper function here just to make testing easier and in general to control the flow of my application easier. And the reason is that in the same way that I have get soccer seasons function, I might have many more functions as I enrich the interface of this class, and I don't want to repeat this class over I don't want to repeat this implementation over and over again. It seems that it is a good candidate for abstraction. So I'm gonna create a function. I'm gonna call it get request. Which get request is gonna take a URL and is gonna either return the JSON that came back or it's gonna raise an exception. So I'm gonna take this from here. I'm gonna put it here. And I'm gonna substitute this with this. And of course the URL remains the same. If everything works out, I'm expecting the unit test to behave as before, and it does. It prints none. Because why? Because I don't return nothing from here. If I do this, now it's gonna print a dictionary, and it does. By doing so, as I explained before, I not only make my code cleaner to follow, but I make it a little bit easier to test. And let's see why. Let's think for a second that we can control the return value of the get request. Meaning, instead of going to the internet and retrieving the data, let's say that I can specify somehow the return value of get request. So in this case, this means that I can now control what is going to be returned from get soccer seasons. And I can make tests much more realistic since I know what's going to be coming back from it. Okay. For this, we need a library that is called mock. And we need to patch the behavior of get request, and instead of returning something that is going to be retrieved on the internet, to retrieve something that we're gonna hardcode to it, we're gonna specify it, and we're gonna see how it works. So to do this, we use a nice decorator that it is uh, provided with Mac. It's called Patch. In Patch, what do? We provide the full path of a function that we want to mark, and we can also provide it with the return value, and in some cases the side effects and other things that we might need to see in a different video, because that's this video is not to explain everything about Patch, but to give us an introduction to it. So in this case, I'm gonna mark this. I'm, I'm gonna change the behavior of get soccer seasons, and what I'm gonna actually change, I'm gonna mark is the underscore get request, this thing here, and I'm gonna specify its return value to be something that I already know. So this list of dictionaries that came back. I have already created a formatted view of one valid request that I already made to this API, which is something like this. So I call it soccer seasons. It results in the result underscore as JSON file. So to make my testing easier, I'm going to also import the result as JSON, and for the return value I'm going to specify the soccer seasons. Let me make it a little bit more readable. So what this thing is going to do is going to substitute what is returned back from get request with this list of dictionaries. So I'm expecting my test not to go through an internet callback in order to get the data, but to return me back data that I already know very well what to look like. So if I run now test request, okay, it gave me an error. It tells me, okay, what this means is that I forgot that each time I am patching an object and I present it to my testing script as a decorator, there is the signature of its testing function is being changed, and it adds a parameter. So in this case, I need to do something like this. I need to add a parameter called marked get request, and this parameter corresponds to the marked underscore get request function. So now if I run my test, boom, now it returns back a dictionary. To make it more easy to understand, let's say that I say instead of returning soccer season, I was creating something like this, and I was saying chunk 1, now if instead of this I was marking it with junk, and running my test, you can see that what is being returned is junk1. So I have full control over this. Let me put it back as it was now. Okay. Of course, I have some work to do now because I don't really think that returning back a Python list consisting with from Python dictionaries is the best way for me to work with this data. Meaning, let's say, we have something that here that's called number of games. Let's say that I wanted to access this variable. So in this case, I need to write a loop, which is gonna look like this, and I'm gonna print soccer season, number of games. But obviously this is not an elegant way, to access the data. I would rather like to do something like this, which obviously is gonna fail now. And it fails because soccer season is a Python dictionary. I have now to think about a way to convert the dictionary to an object. And exactly this is what we're going to be doing now. I'm going to create a function that is going to convert a dictionary to an object. And I might also need to create the reversal as well, but for now let's focus in taking a dictionary or a list of dictionaries and convert it to an object and write the necessary tests for it. Since this is a relatively generic functionality, I'm going to create a new module. I'm going to call it utils, and I'm going to implement this functionality in this module. And the function, I'm going to call it JSON to object. And I'm expecting this to accept a JSON and to return back an object. Let's say I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it converted object. I don't want to put anything there, and I'm just going to return this from there for now. Immediately as I created a new module, I'm going to create a new module test following the same process I did before. I'm going to import unit test. I'm going to call it test creation, meaning since this JSON to object, it creates an object, call it test creation. So I'm gonna do this. I also need, of course, utils. And for now I'm passing none, just to see that it works. Okay. Now I have work to do, meaning I have to specify some input and try to start working with the function until I make it perfect. So let's say I'm passing a very simple JSON for the beginning, and this is going to be an object that is going to consist of name, which is going to be x, y, z, and age, which is going to be 18. So I'm going to be passing JSON. Okay. It still returns a conveyor object because I didn't make any change. But based in the specifications, if I call this result, I'm expecting now a result to have an attribute called name, because the objective is to take this and convert it to an object. Obviously now it's going to fail, and it fails because our object doesn't have a name property. Okay. Now the objective is for us to unwrap this object, this JSON, and convert it to an object. To do so, we need to write a recursive function, which is going to be the JSON to object, that is going to do the unwrapping. JSON, what is passed here, it can be, the way we describe it so far, it can be of 3 different types. It can be a list, it can be a dict, or it can be a value, a string or an integer. So, in this function, we start iterating through these 3 possibilities. So I say if the instance of JSON is list, I have to do something. Else, if it is dictionary, I have to do something else. Or otherwise, I have to do something else. So if it is a list, our job is pretty simple. What we want to return back is another list. And this list is going to go through all the JSONs that are contained in this JSON, and they're going to be converted to objects by using exactly the same function. If the JSON we pass is a dictionary, it means that we need to create a new Python object, and this is why we created this converted object. So I'm going to do this object equal converted object, and then I'm going to iterate key values of this dictionary, and I'm gonna add the corresponding attributes to the object. Now you have to be careful that this value here can be a nested JSON object, so I'm gonna call JSON to object to value, and I'm gonna return this object. The third case is pretty simple because I just return the JSON itself. The JSON in this case is going to be a number or a string, and I no longer need this. So now if I go back and I run my test creation test, you see that I'm getting the name XYZ, and if I do age, now I'm getting 18. Perfect. Now I'm gonna use some attributes of test case to make the testing easier. So I'm gonna say assert equal name. I'm expecting it to be what? XYZ. And age, I'm expecting it to be 18. Perfect. Let's see if it's gonna run. Beautiful. Now it ran perfectly. If instead of 18 I was passing here 180, what's gonna happen? The assertion is gonna fail, and I'm gonna know that I have a problem. I have an error in my test, and I have to fix it. Of course, this is a very trivial case that we are exercising here. Let's make it a little bit more complicated. Instead of an object, now I'm going to have a list of objects. And let's follow the same pattern. And now let's add another one, another attribute. I'm going to call it languages, which is going to be an array, and this array is going to have other objects here. Let's say name, C++, and type, object oriented, and I also am going to have Python and dynamic. And I'm also going to have ABC. I'm going to have 78, and here I'm going to have Java, and here I'm going to have JavaScript. So this is a more difficult, a more complicated JSON to parse. So let's do the same thing we did before, and instead of JSON I'm going to pass JSON1 and see if this is going to work out. Okay. What it tells me now is that list has no attribute name, obviously, because what is coming back now, it is not an object, it is a list. Let's see what came back. came back an object, a list of two objects. So these two objects, they have to match what I have here in this. So if I do result 0 dot name, I'm getting XYZ, and if I do this, I'm getting ABC, which is this. At this point, I'm thinking that it could be good if I had another function which could do the reversal, meaning instead of a JSON to object, to do object to JSON, which is going to take an object, is going to convert it to a Python list or a dictionary. So let's write this function, object to JSON, and obviously it takes an object, and the same way we did this distinction here, we need to think in the same way. So think about the object can either be a dictionary, excuse me, it can either be a Python object, which means it contains an underscore underscore dict underscore underscore. It can be a list, which means it is a list of objects or values, or it can be a value, integer or string or whatever. So I'm starting with this. I say if has attribute object dict. In this case, it means that I founded an object. If is going to be a list, so if is instance object of list, else we just return the object itself. So if it is an object, it means that now we have to return back what? A dictionary. So I could have done something like this, but I want to avoid returning built-in functions, like for example init or any other things like this that might be there. So instead, what I'm gonna do is this. I'm gonna create a dictionary, and I'm gonna populate it. So I'm gonna say for key value in object dict iter items. I'm simply gonna do this. I'm gonna just return. Now in the case that I'm having a list, I have to iterate through the list and return the object to JSON. So I believe that this is going to do the trick. So here I'm going to substitute these two prints with print utils object to JSON result. Boom. Now you see that I'm getting back a list. I'm getting back a list But you see that here this is a converted object, and this happens just because I forgot it to convert the value to an object JSON. If I redo it again, now it is a clear list. Now, using this function, it makes it easy for me to verify that what it was returned back is what is supposed to. And how I'm going to do this? Very easy. Since I know that I'm going to receive a list, I'm expecting this result to be a list, I can use the assert list equal, and this is going to be the received, and we expect the received to be the same as JSON1. Boom. This means what? What we received from JSON to object and what we transform from object to JSON, they work pretty good. Now that we have these utils, we go back to our sucker class. And where we are returning the results of get requests that were before, that currently is consisting of lists and dictionaries, as we can see here. Yeah, you remember that we had this problem here before when we tried to dereference the number of games like this, and we had to do it like this. Okay, now we want to be able to use this syntax, which now gives us an error. Obviously, we need only to import utils, and in our get sucker seasons, we're gonna return the utils dot JSON to object. Let's see. Now it works. Beautiful. If I can also see, for example, I have league, I'm expecting also, to be able to do something like this. Sucker season dot league. Boom. It works. That's good news. Now, the final step for us to test that indeed our test request, it works fine for all the data that we are passing, and can be found in this file here, is to do something similar to what we did in the util tests, where we compared these items. So I go back to soccer test, and what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna compare the lists as they came back. So let's call this received, and expected is gonna be what? Is gonna be the utils object to JSON received, and let's call this received as list, and the received as list needs to be equal to soccer seasons as appears into the result as JSON. So the returned, the received as list here should be equal to result as JSON that soccer season. Let's make it a little bit more readable. Boom. Okay. So, and now if we want to write a client to this function that we wrote the get soccer seasons. It's pretty simple. I create a Python file, I call it main. I'm gonna import soccer, of course, and I'm gonna implement the main section of it, and I'm gonna call it for season in soccer dot get soccer seasons print season dot let's decide, for example, I'm going to print the caption, and I'm going to print the number of games. So now I have the data here, I have caption, I have number of games, 306, etc. And the soccer seasons now, after this call, they are regular Python objects that we can use in any way we like. We can save it in the database, we can save them in Mongo, we can serve it from the web server, or whatever else we want to do. In the following videos, I'm going to talk more about mocking and the mechanisms to improve the unit tested and make it more easier and more elegant. Until then, good coding.